Welcome to Socializing Security, where every week we have a discussion about security, compliance, and beyond.
Our goal is to learn and grow by socializing each week's topic with each other, our guests, and with you.
A quick compliance note, this podcast is meant for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal or regulatory advice.
We're glad you've joined us, and we hope you'll learn along with us. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Socializing Security. It is just Brian again this time around. Going to do another one of the sessions that Milu and I have lovingly termed Brian Rants by himself. So going to talk a little bit about security lessons that you can learn from everyday life. These will be some of my examples, but I encourage you to think along with me in other examples that you may have that are familiar or similar. So we do have one interview we've done probably several episodes by the time this one releases about kind of how do you talk about security, how do you train on security. Some of them touch on storytelling and stuff. And so I'm going to expand a little bit on some of those with my own personal experiences. So here we go. The first one I really want to call out is one that I've been thinking about a lot and just recently got done listening to a podcast that just really drove me to do this one. I've been involved with some urban planning and city development type stuff recently. I live in a small city and just trying to make us a better town, a more sustainable town. It's involved with a group called Strong Towns, which is, if you go to strongtowns.org, you can see all sorts of information about it. And the mandate for the group is really to try to drive Strongs to be more sustainable, to make sure that they can afford to be around for a long time. And some of the premises that go into that are that, cities are working in a way that is not really sustainable and, maybe leading them to be bankrupt and not being able to be a healthy town. And of course, we all want strong towns. We want towns that are going to sustain for a long time. There are going to be places people want to move to, places people want to live. And so really thinking about a lot of that kind of stuff, one of the big important topics is road safety. We talk a lot about how do we make our roads safer? How do we prevent pedestrians getting hit by cars, people on bikes getting hit by cars? It gets into a lot of the, let's dedicate a bike lane that a lot of us have been seeing lately. And so this podcast I was listening to was one of the Strong Towns podcasts, and it was talking about how road design creates aggressive drivers. And the concept there really becomes the fact that how we design our roads is sometimes more important than how people actually drive. Whether they're obviously, alcohol, driving distracted, those types of things can affect it no matter what type of road it is. But we see a lot of roads being built these days that are more like highways as they go through the middle of towns, which is the case in my town. We talk a lot about a major highway going through the middle of my town, right down Main Street. And so as we try to build a healthy town, we want to have a town that has a good core, as a good place for people to start up businesses and to draw people to that area to create community and that kind of thing. When you have a 4-lane, 5-lane highway going down the middle of that area, it makes it hard because it's hard to walk down and talk when there's semis flying by. It's hard to feel safe with your kids running around in case they run out into the street, those types of things. And so the concept of road design, the wider the road is, the less obstacles that are along the side of the roads. One example that they use is that making a right turn onto a road that has a fence or some sort of barrier in the middle or on the far side that, hey, pedestrians shouldn't be here. I don't need to pay attention to pedestrians. I'm just going to keep going and not look. Could lead to problems when somebody tries to cross there for some reason. In the scenario he was talking about, it happened to be somebody that was that was impaired and didn't really know what they were doing. Driver was not impaired whatsoever, but they didn't expect to see that. So how does that apply then to the concept of cybersecurity? So that's a real world example. It's a thing that I and people in the Strong Towns movement think about. And so how does that apply to cybersecurity? How do I use that real world knowledge to be a better cybersecurity practitioner, for example? As I was listening to this podcast, I couldn't stop thinking about that. And one of the big things that Strong Towns, we talk about street safety, that we point out a lot is the fact that we tend to blame people rather than blaming the design. So how does that apply to cybersecurity? How can we use the knowledge of that real world scenario in cybersecurity? Well, really what it kind of comes down to is that when something bad happens, we tend to blame the user. Whether that be cybersecurity, whether that be the driver, whether it be the pedestrian, whether it be the person on the bike. The people failed. But really, the system should be built in a way to, one, handle how people fail, and secondarily, to try to ensure that they can't fail in the first place. So if I take that example of the road that has the barrier that should prevent pedestrians from walking in that area, and any of us that have driven, particularly in the Midwest or the West of the United States, have probably seen this, where people will walk wherever they can get to. And sometimes they will find ways to walk in places that they should be completely barricaded from, whether that's, cutting through a fence that happens to be loose and they can, a chain link fence. There's a section missing from a bigger barrier. Homer Simpsoning through a hedge. They will find ways to get in the places they're not supposed to be. And so even in those scenarios, we need to consider what failed there and how failure is going to affect the system, whether that be a road with cars going 30 miles an hour, or it be our firewalls and our EDR tools and all those things that we put in our system in order to prevent malware from happening and threat actors from doing bad things. We need to make sure that we've got all the places and pieces in there. A good analogy with cybersecurity ends up being the concept of zero trust. We assume our environment's going to get breached at some point. And so by segregating the systems and making sure that it's not easy to jump from one system to the next, that helps to prevent things from happening when the system fails. When the firewalls fail us, they get in, and now all of a sudden they're in our Exchange server. They're in our email server on premises. What do we do about that? Well, if we isolate it so that email server having to connect to anything else in the environment is going to require authentication. It's going to require them going through hoops. We make sure that only the things an email server should be able to touch, or somebody on an email server should be able to touch, that they're not going to be able to jump from there to our electronic medical records, for example. Like, there's no reason those two systems should be talking, so let's block them from talking. So things like that. When you think systematically, you think about where those failure points are and how they could fall apart. A second one I thought of was projects. I used to be a practitioner. I was in both development and IT administration, did tons of projects, did some consulting and post-sales implementation in the IT infrastructure space. So I've dealt with a lot of projects. I've dealt with a lot of project managers. I've dealt with a lot of weird things in the corporate structure, in the corporate environment, and saw no lack of things that could fail in that model as well. Hey, we want to accomplish this thing. We get agreement. Everybody's on board with it, except for that one group. And that one group is going to drag whatever they can. They're going to, maybe they're going to be explicitly trying to stop the project for whatever reason. And that makes things go off the rails. And sometimes it's just the infrastructure that we have. Sometimes it's the tools that we're trying to combine or do things with. Sometimes it's just the structure of the organization just doesn't allow change to happen in a way that it needs to happen. Regardless, when something fails, we start pointing fingers. We start trying to say, oh, that person didn't do their job, or that person didn't apply that patch, or that person got in our way and wouldn't allow us to implement that system, have the downtime we needed in order to reboot it. Whatever that might be, we tend to point our fingers at people. And again, we got to be really careful about scapegoating, because again, in cybersecurity, if we scapegoat people constantly, that has a mental effect. If I keep telling people, you are the ones that are failing our cybersecurity, we keep having these breaches because of you, that's not a healthy way to deal with it. Yes, people may be needing more training. They may need to better understand what they should and shouldn't be doing. But at the same time, we need to make sure they can't do the things, because quite frankly, people make mistakes and we have to accept that. Another great example from the real world that happened recently was the signal group leaking of military planning that happened with the US government. And I keep telling people, Signal's a great platform. Now, put aside the fact that from a government perspective, they shouldn't have been using Signal because it wasn't an authorized tool for the government to be using for communications. Put that aside, Signal's one of the best tools out there to use. Emilu and I have talked about that multiple times. Because it is secure, it is one of the most secure end-to-end platforms. The problem there ends up being that, a user added another user that shouldn't have been in that group, and now that person was able to see that information, and that person just happened to be a journalist who then published about that and was talking about that. So again, a situation where, yes, people are going to fail us, but do we allow our systems to fail because of the way people are behaving? We have to assume that people are going to fail. Just like we have to assume all the other systems are going to fail at some point. Another great example that I like in all of these examples up to this point really point to this is the concept of normal accidents. This was a theory that got put together based on a bunch of investigation that happened in the 70s around major disasters. 3 Mile Island in the United States was a great example of that, and one of the bigger ones that they looked at. And what they found there is that the system was so complex and the pieces and parts within that system, the subsystems, if you will, were so tightly coupled that inherently created unexpected interactions, and that those interactions and the tight coupling of those different actions is what led to a cascade of failures that caused a nuclear reactor to start to vent and to leak. And in fact, the security systems that should have stopped it in the first place were a part of that. They actually contributed to it because they were tightly coupled and highly integrated and complex. And so the idea there, and they've applied it to a lot of other things, including the Challenger explosion in the 80s. In an updated version of this book, they touched on that as well. And the idea is that those failures of the systems create accidents. And those accidents are quote unquote normal because they are inherent to the complexity of the system. The systems that we build that are complex and tightly coupled, it is normal for us to have an accident. It is normal for those systems to fail at some point because there are so many interactions, we don't understand them all, especially if they start to cascade. If you're a visual learner, if you're listening to the audio, it may not help a lot. If you're watching the video, I don't have graphics, so it's probably not going to help either. But think about 2 gears together and working very tightly. They don't move very much, which is generally considered a good thing. You want precision in there. Now imagine one of those gets loose and starts to wobble, and that's going to wobble the other one a little bit and potentially break it. And then imagine a series of these now all doing that, and they're all tight together. So as one loosens, the next one starts to loosen, and the next one starts to loosen, and so on and so forth. That is the concept of a normal accident, is that these things will cascade. And by having a lot of complexity in the system, that means that there's just more area. Applying this to cybersecurity, we have complex systems in IT. And an accident in the concept or a failure in the concept of cybersecurity is an intruder getting into the environment. So being able to account for that, being able to expect failure to happen, and more importantly, trying to make our systems less complex, trying to make them less tightly coupled. And that's, again, pointing back to the zero trust concept, is to loosely couple our systems to make sure that they're not fully integrated. Like, only integrate them as much as you have to, and make sure everything else is completely disassociated from them at that point. Some other examples, kind of getting out of the systems aspect of things, but the concept of a go bag. If you're not familiar with this, this is if I had to evacuate because of a hurricane or a fire or, some sort of, like if you're in a country that is war torn, you may have this concept of a go bag, which is these are the things I need to survive for at least a couple days, ideally maybe a week, because you know what you need to survive. And without putting any other inputs, I may be on the road driving away from this danger for a week. If there's civil unrest, I may not feel safe going into a department store to go buy more water or something like that. Like, trying to have the supplies that you need for the type of disaster you have to deal with. And different disasters will require different things. A fire you may have to be on the go for a week because it's something that's going to grow and come at you. A hurricane could be something that you kind of know which direction it's going to go, and you go the opposite direction. So understanding the disaster that you're going to have to deal with. Now, this is those of you that have done any sort of disaster recovery planning will probably find this very familiar. This is something that is exactly what we think about when we think about disaster recovery, is what is the disaster I'm expecting and what do I need to do to get things back up and running? At work, we use the concept of a minimal viable business. What is the minimum thing we need to keep our business running? This can get a lot more complex in the cybersecurity space just because there is a lot more unknowns that could happen. If I'm in Florida, I know I'm generally going to be dealing with hurricanes, maybe the occasional flood. In either case, I need to get out of this area and out of a pretty common swath of land that it could potentially be happening within. And so I can plan for that. I live in the Midwest, and tornadoes become our major natural disaster to deal with. And those are usually pretty pointed. I don't have to go very far because they tend to not be very big. They tend not to be on the ground for very long. Climate change, that's changing quite a bit. It's been an interesting few years over the last decade and a half or so. But for the most part, I don't have to fail over to California or Washington State or something like that. I can usually fail over to the next state over and be okay. So the concept of a go bag is have everything planned and ready to go. Do you know what your evacuation route is? Do you know where you're going to go when you evacuate? Do you have the supplies that you need to be able to survive to get to the next place that you could supply? Same concept with when we talk about disaster recovery and cyber recovery is you got to know what your plans are. You got to know what the bits and pieces that you need, the supplies you're going to need to be able to recover and deal with that scenario. So have that plan, have that prepared and ready to go. Another concept that some may have more positive views on this than others, and one I wish maybe we can dig in deeper with Milu someday is, having a lawyer on retainer. It sounds like an elitist thing to have, but at the very least, kind of understand where you would go if you needed legal help. If you were in a situation where something bad could happen and you could be in a situation where you need a lawyer quick, whether you're traveling abroad or you're living in another country and the threat of deportation, it could be the concept of, maybe you go out and protest and you're potentially going to get arrested on occasion, knowing who you would call, that's that concept of you get a single call. Who are you going to call? And what needs to happen when you make that call? So ideally that call is going to, just like we do in disaster recovery or cyber recovery, you want to have that plan. You want to automate it as much as possible so that at the time of that disaster happening, I can push a button and automation takes over at that point and does a bunch of things for me. Maybe I have to give it some inputs. Maybe there's checkpoints I need to look into, but ideally everything that needs to happen is automatically planned and just goes. Again, with disaster recovery, that's the way I always worked with my customers was you need to lay it out, because ideally you want to have somebody log in from their phone, push a button, say go. Maybe there's a second person that needs to authorize the go on that, and then deal with whatever disaster happened that may have affected you and your family so that the systems can restore while you're triaging your current situation, making sure that nobody's in mortal danger. And then when things are settled, then you can start to focus on work and go and do the things that the business needs you to do. Because you should always take care of your family first. And any company that disagrees with you is not a place I would recommend working. But that's my personal opinion. So that's kind of the idea. Hopefully, at least one of those ideas resonated with you. Those are things that I've been thinking about a lot, especially as we've been doing this podcast and trying to think about how it's better to socialize security. How can I talk to the people that are not security professionals? How can I talk to the people that aren't IT professionals? How can I talk to the people that are completely ignorant of technology and how things work, and they still have to deal with how do they protect their credit card numbers? How do they protect their social security number? How do they look at email and know which things they should and shouldn't click on? These are concepts that I've been noodling on a lot lately, trying to put together that story. And that is something that we're looking to do, is to have some episodes around how do you talk to your family? How do you talk to your friends that aren't technically savvy? So hopefully we'll have some stuff there. Hopefully this is a good kind of thought process for you, a mental exercise, if you will, as to how you should go about that. So I hope you appreciate that. I hope everything is going well for all of you and that you haven't had to grab your go bags in a long time and that you are keeping it well supplied, because some of the things in your go bag may need maintenance, just like your DR plans do. So take care, everybody, and we'll see you in the next episode. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Socializing Security. We hope you learned a thing or two with us.
If you'd like to continue socializing with us on this topic or have feedback, we'd love to hear from you on LinkedIn or social media. Just search for Socializing Security. Or you can email us at info@socializingsecurity.com.
Until next time, stay social and stay secure.